Title: The Shadow of Ettrick. Chapter 1: The Disappearance. The mist settled thick over Ettrick like a shroud, muffling sound and dulling light, casting the town in an eerie, ghostly glow. It had been a peaceful place once, a town of narrow cobblestone streets and quiet, whispering woods. But now, a heavy silence had taken hold, and shadows seemed to stretch a little longer, cling a little closer, as though the town itself were holding its breath. Agnes McIntyre, a lively, bright-eyed girl of 9, had vanished the night before while playing near the edge of the woods. Her parents, once carefree, now looked as hollow as the trees beyond town, their voices breaking as they cried her name into the darkness. They had searched all night, lanterns in hand, calling for Agnes, their voices echoing unanswered through the dense, silent forest. But no trace of her was found, and as dawn broke, hope began to wane. By morning, news of Agnes's disappearance had spread through the town like wildfire. Ettrick's townsfolk gathered in the small square, voices hushed with worry, eyes wide with suspicion. Parents gripped their children's hands tightly, casting wary glances at the looming trees. It was not the first time a child had vanished near the woods, and the forest had always carried a certain darkness. But now, that darkness felt closer, more present, as if it had slipped past the trees and into their very homes. The woods at the edge of Ettrick had long been shrouded in superstition. Tales were told of restless spirits, of voices calling from the shadows, of ghostly figures glimpsed between the trees. People would whisper about an old curse, an ancient sorrow that lay buried within the roots of those trees, though few spoke of it openly. Still, it was one thing to tell ghost stories in the safety of a warm hearth. It was another to find them creeping into your reality. As the day wore on and the search party expanded, unease grew into something more tangible, something that twisted and spread like ivy through the hearts of the people. Suspicion bloomed, hungry for a target. It did not take long for their thoughts to turn toward Herbert Solomon. Herbert was a peculiar man, a recluse who lived alone in a small, weather-beaten cabin at the edge of town. He was a tall, gaunt figure with hollow cheeks and a sunken gaze, his clothes always caked in earth from his endless wanderings in the woods. He was a man of few words, and those he spoke were often to himself, as if conversing with shadows only he could see. Children avoided him. Parents warned their young ones to steer clear of old Herbert, who some whispered was mad, others whispered was worse. Despite his strangeness, Herbert had always kept to himself, his dealings limited to the occasional trip to town to trade for supplies. But now, with a child missing, his solitude made him a perfect target for fear and suspicion. Rumours began to swirl, fueled by the townsfolk's need to make sense of the horror that had visited their home. They whispered about Herbert's strange habits, his long, silent walks through the woods, the peculiar trinkets he gathered, bones, rocks, herbs of unknown origin. Some claimed he practiced dark arts, that he communed with spirits in the forest, that he had made some pact with forces beyond their understanding. Mrs. McIntyre, Agnes's mother, was the loudest voice among them, her face pale and her eyes red with grief. "It's him!" she cried, clutching her shawl tightly. "That man's been a shadow lurking and watching. I've seen him at the edge of our field, muttering to himself. I should have known. I should have known." Her words ignited the crowd, filling them with a dark energy, a need to take action. A murmur rippled through the gathered townsfolk, a shared understanding taking root in their hearts. Fear has a way of bringing people together, binding them in ways that reason and logic cannot. It was easier, they realized, to blame Herbert than to face the possibility that something nameless and ancient lurked within their woods, waiting to strike. As the sun began to set, casting the town in a bloody red glow, a group of men, fathers, husbands and brothers, gathered torches and lanterns, their faces set with grim determination. They marched toward Herbert's cabin, their footsteps heavy, their breaths low and tense. They would not allow another child to be taken. Herbert's cabin was as eerie as the man himself, half hidden by twisted trees, its windows dark and empty like watching eyes. The air around it was colder, stiller, as though the trees themselves were holding their breath. The men approached cautiously, torches held high, their eyes darting toward the shadows that seemed to press closer with every step. One of the men, James, knocked on the cabin door, the sound echoing through the silence. "Herbert," he called, his voice hard, edged with suspicion. "We know you're in there. Open up." There was no answer. The men exchanged uneasy glances, their grip tightening on the torches, their bodies tensed for movement. They knocked again, harder this time, but still, there was only silence. Finally, Thomas, a burly blacksmith with a reputation for a quick temper, shoved his shoulder against the door, forcing it open. The door creaked, swinging inward to reveal a dark, cluttered interior. Herbs hung from the ceiling, their dried leaves brushing against the men's heads as they stepped inside. Strange trinkets and charms lined the shelves. Bones, feathers, polished stones, all arranged with a careful precision that seemed to mock their rough intrusion. But it was the smell that hit them first. A strange, pungent aroma that filled the air, heavy and cloying, clinging to their skin and clothes like an invisible shroud. It was the scent of earth and decay, a smell that seemed to seep from the walls, from the very floorboards. The men gagged, covering their noses, their eyes watering as they looked around. "Where is he?" one of them muttered, his voice muffled. "Where's Herbert?" They searched the cabin, turning over piles of dried herbs, opening drawers filled with strange powders and oils. But there was no sign of Herbert, only a growing sense of dread that seemed to thicken with each passing moment. The silence was oppressive, pressing down on them like a weight, filling their ears with a low, faint hum that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. And then they saw it. A small, crumpled piece of cloth tucked beneath one of the shelves, half hidden by a pile of dried leaves. One of the men bent down, his hands trembling as he picked it up, unfolding it to reveal a small, hand-sewn doll. Its fabric faded and worn, its face stitched with two dark, empty eyes. It was a child's toy, the kind of doll a mother would make for her daughter, simple but filled with love. The sight of it sent a shiver through the men, a cold, creeping horror that left them feeling exposed, vulnerable. The doll felt wrong, its empty eyes staring up at them, accusing, as though it knew their darkest thoughts, their deepest fears. That's Agnes's," whispered one of the men, his voice barely audible, thick with dread. "Her mother sewed that for her." A wave of anger and fear washed over them, fueling their suspicions, their need to make sense of the darkness that had touched their town. The doll was proof enough, a link between the missing girl and the man who lurked in the shadows, who walked alone in the woods, who lived among herbs and bones and whispers. Driven by a rage born of terror, they began to gather the items in Herbert's cabin, piling them in the center of the room. Feathers, bones, herbs, all the trinkets and tokens of Herbert's strange existence were heaped together, their meaning lost to the men, who saw only signs of witchcraft, symbols of the dark arts. As the last light of day faded and the shadows deepened, they set the pile alight, the flames licking at the walls, the smoke filling the cabin with a thick, acrid cloud. The men watched, their faces twisted with a mixture of satisfaction and horror, as the fire consumed Herbert's life, reducing it to ashes. But as they stood there, watching the flames, a strange sound echoed through the darkness, a low, mournful whisper that seemed to rise from the very heart of the woods, filling the air with a sorrow so deep it left them breathless. It was a sound of mourning, of regret, of something ancient and wounded that had been disturbed. The men looked at one another, their faces pale, their hands trembling. They had come here to rid themselves of a threat, to protect their town from the darkness that had claimed a child. But now, as the fire raged and the night closed in, they wondered if they had done something far worse, if they had awakened something that could not be contained, something that would haunt them long after the flames had died. As the last ember flickered and the men turned to leave, a shadow lingered in the trees, watching, waiting, its hollow eyes filled with a sorrow that would never fade. Chapter 2. Echoes in the Forest. The dawn after Herbert's cabin burned was unnaturally quiet, as if the land itself were holding its breath. A thick fog hung low over the fields and twisted trees around Ettrick, creeping into town, muffling even the faintest sounds. There were no birds singing, no rustle of leaves, only a heavy silence that seeped into the homes of Ettrick's villagers and settled like a curse. In the days following the blaze, the townsfolk of Ettrick tried to return to normalcy, but a pall of unease lingered in every corner. Mothers kept their children close, doors were locked before dusk, and neighbours who once greeted each other warmly now exchanged wary glances. The charred remains of Herbert's cabin stood at the edge of the woods, like a ghostly reminder of their recent act, dark and skeletal, with the smell of burnt wood hanging faintly in the air. But the strangest change was in the woods themselves. The forest, usually filled with life, had grown sinister. Shadows seemed to twist and linger, watching anyone who dared to walk its paths. Whispered voices floated on the air at night, drifting into the town on the cold wind. People began to report strange sightings, fleeting shapes in the trees, flickers of light in the mist, and most disturbingly, a figure standing among the trees. A tall, thin silhouette, silent and still, watching. It was 2 days after the fire when young Ewan MacLeod, a curious boy of 12, decided he would explore the woods. Despite his mother's warnings, the pull of adventure and mystery was too strong. Ewan had heard his father's hushed conversations about Herbert's supposed dark magic, and he couldn't resist seeing the remnants of the old man's cabin for himself. So, while the town slept, he crept from his house, shivering in the pre-dawn chill, and made his way toward the woods. The path leading to Herbert's cabin was lined with twisted, gnarled trees, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. As he walked, Ewan felt a strange weight pressing down on him, a cold, sinking feeling that made him pause, considering whether to turn back. But his curiosity outweighed his fear, and he continued, pushing through the dense fog that thickened as he neared the edge of the forest. At last, he saw the remains of Herbert's cabin, a pile of charred wood and ash, blackened and broken. The structure was almost unrecognizable, but among the ruins, Ewan could see strange shapes, herbs and trinkets burned halfway to ash, the remnants of jars that had cracked under the heat. The sight was eerie, but it was the silence that truly unnerved him. There was something unnatural about it, a silence so deep that it swallowed even his own breath. As he moved closer, his foot hit something hard. Ewan looked down and saw a doll lying in the ash. It was Agnes's doll, half burned, with one eye missing, its stitched mouth twisted in a strange, sorrowful expression. He shuddered, but something kept him from looking away. "Ewan!" A soft whisper drifted through the air, chilling him to the bone. He spun around, but there was no one there, only the silent trees and the thick, creeping fog. The whisper came again, faint yet insistent, like a voice from another world. "Ewan, come closer." The boy felt his heart race, but he couldn't move, couldn't tear his gaze away from the twisted shadows among the trees. The voice was calling to him, pulling him toward the heart of the forest, and he felt a strange compulsion to follow. He took a step forward, then another, his footsteps echoing in the unnatural silence. But just as he was about to cross the line between the cabin ruins and the forest, a hand grabbed his shoulder, yanking him back. Ewan gasped, the spell broken, and turned to see his father, James MacLeod, his face pale and drawn. "Ewan, what in God's name are you doing out here?" his father demanded, his voice trembling with fear and anger. "You should never have come here," Ewan stammered, trying to explain, but James wouldn't hear it. He dragged his son back toward the village, his grip firm and unyielding. As they left, Ewan cast one last glance at the forest, and his heart skipped a beat. Among the shadows, he saw a figure standing silently at the edge of the trees, watching him. It was tall, thin, and cloaked in darkness, its face obscured. He couldn't see its eyes, but he felt its gaze, cold and unblinking, fixed on him with an intensity that made his blood run cold. Word of Ewan's encounter spread quickly, and the people of Ettrick grew even more fearful. Many believed Herbert's spirit had returned, angry and vengeful, haunting the woods as a dark spectre. Some claimed they had heard his voice in the night, calling out from the forest, and a few even swore they had seen his ghost, standing among the trees, watching with hollow eyes. The McIntyres, who had led the charge against Herbert, were the most affected. Mrs. McIntyre, once loud and indignant, had grown pale and silent, her eyes haunted. She had nightmares every night, visions of Agnes calling to her from the shadows, her voice faint and pleading. Each morning, she woke with a growing sense of dread, a feeling that her daughter was not lost, but trapped somewhere between life and death, held by forces beyond their understanding. Her husband, Samuel, dismissed the visions as the product of grief, but he too was shaken. Shadows seemed to gather in their home, clinging to corners, stretching out like grasping fingers. Strange sounds drifted through the night, the creak of footsteps on empty floors, the faint murmur of voices coming from nowhere. Desperate to rid themselves of the curse, the townsfolk turned to the church, seeking comfort in prayer and protection from the darkness that loomed over Ettrick. The village priest, Father Donovan, led them in nightly vigils, offering prayers for the lost children and pleading for Herbert's spirit to find peace. But each night, as they knelt in prayer, a cold wind swept through the church, extinguishing candles, leaving them shivering in the dark. Father Donovan himself began to feel Herbert's presence, a weight that seemed to press on him, filling the air with a sense of sorrow and anger. He began hearing whispers in his own chambers, low and mournful, echoing through the silence. It was one night, while deep in prayer, that he felt a chill pass over him, as if a shadow had moved through the room. He opened his eyes, heart pounding, and saw the flicker of a shape standing in the doorway, a tall, thin figure, cloaked in shadow, with eyes like empty pits. The priest froze, a sense of dread washing over him, but he forced himself to speak, his voice trembling. "Herbert, if it is you, leave this town in peace. We are sorry for what we've done." But the figure only stared, its hollow gaze piercing through the priest, filling him with a despair so deep it felt like his soul was being drawn into the darkness. And then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure was gone, leaving only a faint chill and the lingering scent of smoke. Father Donovan fell to his knees, his heart racing, his mind reeling. He knew then that Herbert's spirit was far from at peace. The man they had burned was innocent, and now his restless soul lingered, bound to the town and the woods, cursed to roam the darkness, searching for justice that could never be granted. As rumours spread, the townsfolk became prisoners of their own fear. Windows were shuttered, doors locked, and children kept inside. The once lively streets grew empty, and laughter was replaced by whispered prayers and anxious glances. Ettrick had become a town of shadows, haunted not only by the memory of its own cruelty, but by the dark presence that now lurked at its edge. And still, Agnes was nowhere to be found. Chapter 3. Whispers in the dark. Days passed, but the heavy weight of Herbert Solomon's death did not lift from Ettrick. It clung to the town, creeping into every corner and leaving a shadow of doubt in every mind. People moved like ghosts, too fearful to speak loudly, too frightened to look one another in the eyes, and every corner of the town seemed shrouded in an oppressive silence. As dusk settled each evening, strange occurrences began to unfold, thickening the air with a chill that was both unexplainable and undeniable. Footsteps echoed in empty alleys, whispers carried on the wind, and faint lights flickered deep within the forest, illuminating brief glimpses of the shadows between the trees. Yet, no one dared to venture into the woods to investigate. Among the townsfolk, one person remained haunted in a way that went beyond fear. Mary McIntyre, Agnes's mother. Since her daughter's disappearance, she'd been plagued by nightmares so vivid and chilling that they left her gasping awake in the darkness, unable to shake the feeling that someone or something was watching her. In her dreams, Mary found herself standing in the heart of the woods, surrounded by dense shadows that seemed to move and breathe. She would hear a soft, desperate voice, Agnes's voice, calling out from somewhere within the trees, and though she tried to run toward it, her feet felt bound, unable to move. She could feel eyes on her, a cold gaze that sent a chill down her spine. Every time she woke, she would find herself drenched in sweat, the whisper of her daughter's voice still lingering in her mind, filling her with both hope and terror. One night, after another nightmare had ripped her from sleep, Mary lay in bed, staring into the darkness, her mind racing. She was filled with a gnawing sense of guilt, a whispering thought that grew louder with each passing night. What if Herbert had been innocent? What if, In their haste to find someone to blame, they had condemned an innocent man. The thought was unbearable, a knot in her stomach that twisted every time she remembered his haunted, pleading eyes as they set fire to his cabin. Unable to bear it any longer, Mary decided to seek answers. Perhaps Herbert's spirit was indeed lingering, waiting for justice, unable to move on because he had been wronged. She could not rest until she knew the truth, no matter how terrifying it might be. The next day, Mary visited Father Donovan at the church. The priest's face was pale and drawn, shadows lining his eyes as though he too had been haunted by sleepless nights. He had heard the whispers, felt the cold touch of something otherworldly in his chambers. "Father," Mary whispered, her voice barely above a breath, I need your guidance." Father Donovan studied her with weary eyes. He had seen the burden she carried, the sorrow that had settled over her like a dark cloud. He had heard her cries of anguish during the vigils, her prayers for forgiveness whispered into the empty pews. "Come, Mary," he said gently, guiding her to sit. "Tell me what troubles you." Mary hesitated, wringing her hands. "It's Herbert. I see him. In my dreams. And I hear Agnes's voice calling out to me, begging me to come find her. Father, what if we were wrong? What if we took the life of an innocent man?" Father Donovan's face grew even paler, his hands trembling as he folded them in his lap. "I have asked myself the same, Mary. Every night I pray for forgiveness, and yet, the whispers, the shadows, they do not leave me." He paused, lowering his voice. "There is something dark that has been awakened here. I fear we have stirred forces we do not understand." Mary's heart pounded as she listened, her dread deepening. "Father, please, help me understand. If we've wronged Herbert, if he's still lingering, what can we do?" Father Donovan looked away, his face tight with sorrow. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I believe his spirit seeks justice. Perhaps the only way to appease him is to find the truth of what happened to your daughter." As determined, Mary set out to uncover any clue, any hint that might explain Agnes's disappearance. She spoke to the townspeople, asked if anyone had seen anything unusual before that fateful night, but her inquiries were met with hesitant glances and quick, fearful denials. No one wanted to speak of the incident, as though acknowledging it would bring Herbert's vengeful spirit into their homes. But Mary pressed on. She was willing to face whatever darkness awaited her, if it meant bringing Agnes back, or at least finding peace for her tormented soul. That night, Mary stood at the edge of the woods, clutching Agnes's doll, which she had retrieved from the ruins of Herbert's cabin. The air was still, thick with the scent of earth and damp leaves. She took a deep breath, calling out softly, "Agnes! Agnes, can you hear me?" Her voice faded into the silence, swallowed by the shadows that loomed before her. She waited, her heart racing, every muscle in her body tense with fear. Just as she was about to turn back, a faint whisper drifted through the trees. "Mother, help me." The voice was faint, fragile, yet unmistakably Agnes's. Mary's heart lurched as she took a step forward, her hands trembling. "Agnes," she called, her voice breaking. "Where are you, my love?" "Follow the light," the voice whispered, so soft it was barely audible. But as Mary looked deeper into the woods, she saw a faint, flickering glow, like a lantern bobbing in the darkness. Compelled by the hope of finding her daughter, Mary moved forward, her steps hesitant, each one taking her deeper into the forest. The shadows seemed to close around her, the air growing colder, sharper, with each step. She could feel the weight of unseen eyes watching her from the darkness, feel the presence of something ancient and powerful, lurking just beyond her sight. As she drew closer to the light, she saw a figure standing in the clearing, tall and thin, his face hidden in shadow. Mary's heart froze as she recognized the silhouette. Herbert Solomon. Her instinct was to flee, but something held her in place, a strange compulsion that made her feet feel rooted to the ground. The figure moved forward, his face still shrouded in darkness, yet his eyes gleamed with an unnatural light, piercing and sorrowful. "Herbert," Mary whispered, her voice barely a breath. If you can hear me, please, tell me what happened to my daughter. Help me understand." The figure tilted his head, his eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her shiver. And then, in a voice that was both familiar and distant, he spoke. "Seek the truth where shadows hide. Look not to the living, but to those who watch from the dark. Your daughter lies beyond the veil, held by those who walk unseen." With that, the figure dissolved into the mist, leaving Mary alone in the clearing, the light fading until there was only darkness. She stood there, trembling, her mind racing with his words. He had pointed her toward a truth hidden in the shadows, a truth that went beyond the world she knew. And in her heart, Mary felt a terrible realization begin to take shape, a suspicion that someone within the town itself held the answers, that perhaps it wasn't a stranger who had taken her daughter, but someone who wore a familiar face. In the next morning, Mary returned to the village, her resolve hardened. Herbert's words echoed in her mind, filling her with a grim determination. She would find the truth, no matter where it led her, no matter who it exposed. The townsfolk watched her with wary eyes, whispering behind her back, their glances filled with fear and suspicion, but Mary paid them no mind. She was no longer afraid of what they thought, no longer concerned with their judgments. Her only focus was on finding Agnes, on unravelling the mystery that had bound her daughter's fate to Herbert's restless spirit. As she walked through the square, she felt a shift in the air, a sensation that made her skin prickle. She glanced toward the church, where Father Donovan stood on the steps, his eyes hollow, his face pale. He looked at her, his expression unreadable, and in that moment, Mary knew that he too had felt Herbert's presence, had sensed the darkness that lingered over Ettrick, and as she met his gaze, she understood that she was no longer alone in her quest. Chapter 4. Shadows of the Past. Mary awoke with a start, her dreams haunted by visions of Herbert's sorrowful eyes and her daughter's voice calling to her from the shadows. Her encounters with Herbert's spirit had unsettled her deeply, and her mind reeled from the cryptic words he'd whispered to her in the forest. "Look not to the living, but to those who watch from the dark." Determined to follow Herbert's message, Mary dressed quickly and left her house before dawn. As she walked through the quiet streets, she felt the weight of the town's judgment on her, the gazes of her neighbours peering through their windows, eyes filled with suspicion and fear. But she was beyond caring what they thought. Something dark lurked within Ettrick, something that had taken her daughter and stolen the peace of everyone in the village, and she was determined to find it, no matter what. Father Donovan met her at the church steps, his face as pale and weary as her own. They didn't exchange words, only nods of mutual understanding. He too had felt the chill of Herbert's presence, the lingering sorrow of a spirit wronged. In the dim light of the morning, they walked together into the sanctuary, their footsteps echoing in the empty pews, and knelt before the altar, seeking answers from a power beyond themselves. "Mary," Father Donovan began quietly, his voice breaking the heavy silence, "I must confess, I too have been haunted by Herbert. He spoke to me last night, or at least, I think he did. I was in my study, deep in prayer, and I felt a cold hand on my shoulder. Then I heard a voice, low and filled with grief, saying, 'You have turned away from truth for fear of shadows.'" Mary felt a shiver run down her spine. The words echoed Herbert's message to her. Warnings, hints, allusions to a truth that they could barely comprehend. "Father," she whispered, "whatever happened to Herbert? It was more than just fear. It feels like the forest itself is alive with his sorrow, as if he is bound to something ancient, something waiting to be released." Father Donovan nodded, his gaze heavy with a haunted understanding. "Then we must seek out his story, his past. There is something in his history that ties him to all of this, a thread connecting him, the woods, and our town's shadows. I fear we may have overlooked something vital." Their first step was to gather any records on Herbert's life before he had come to Ettrick. In the dusty archives of the church, they combed through old documents, town records, and even journal entries from past priests who had served in Ettrick. The more they read, the more they felt the weight of history bearing down on them, as if the past itself were warning them of the danger they faced. Hours passed, and at last, Mary stumbled upon a fragile letter, its edges yellowed with age. It was written by the previous priest, Father McRae, in a script that was shaky and hurried, as though the words had been written in a moment of fear. September 3rd, 1823. I fear that our town has harboured darkness for too long. Herbert Solomon, a man misunderstood, has been unjustly condemned by whispers and superstitions. His solitude, his strange ways, they were never proof of his guilt, yet the people see him as an omen, a threat. There are rumours that his family vanished under mysterious circumstances, but I have come to believe they were taken by something else, something beyond, and I suspect he knows this truth. He told me once, before the townsfolk turned against him, that there are spirits in the woods, entities that watch us, unseen. He spoke of voices that called to him, luring him to the shadows, tempting him to give in. I am certain he has seen something others cannot, something our faith alone cannot shield us from. But now, with the villagers poised to rid themselves of him, I fear that by silencing him, they will only awaken the darkness that lies in wait. I have tried to warn them, to tell them that he is a protector, not a monster, but my words fall on deaf ears. They will burn his home, and in doing so, they may release that which they seek to destroy. Pray for us, for I fear the day of reckoning is near. Mary's hands shook as she finished reading, her mind reeling. Herbert hadn't been the dark presence haunting the town. He had been a shield against something far worse. By burning him, they had shattered that protection, unleashing an ancient darkness that now stalked their village. And her daughter, innocent and unsuspecting, had been the first to suffer for their mistake. "Father," she whispered, her voice trembling, "we were wrong. We unleashed something by killing him. He was never our enemy." Father Donovan's face paled as he read the letter, his fingers trembling as he traced the faded ink. "Then we are cursed by our own fear, Mary. We feared what we did not understand and created a darkness we can no longer control." He paused, looking into her eyes. "But if Herbert was a protector, then he may still be trying to help us. Perhaps his spirit lingers to warn us, to give us a chance to make amends." Mary nodded, a cold resolve settling over her. "Then we must go to his resting place and seek his forgiveness. Perhaps he can tell us how to put this right." At that night, they ventured into the woods, carrying only a lantern and their determination. The forest loomed around them, dark and oppressive, its twisted branches reaching out like skeletal hands. Shadows shifted and writhed, and the wind carried faint whispers, as if the trees themselves were mourning. They reached the charred remains of Herbert's cabin, now little more than ashes and blackened wood. In the centre of the ruin lay a patch of earth that had been disturbed, as though something had recently risen from beneath it. They stood in silence, the weight of their guilt pressing down on them, as they each whispered prayers for forgiveness. Father Donovan knelt, his voice barely a whisper. "Herbert, if you are here, if you can hear us, please, show us the way. Tell us what we must do." For a moment there was only silence, the stillness so deep it felt as though the world had paused. But then a chill filled the air, a coldness that seeped into their bones, and the shadows around them thickened, coalescing into a figure. Herbert's spirit stood before them, his form translucent, his eyes filled with a sorrow so deep it seemed to echo through the forest. Mary's breath caught in her throat as she looked into his eyes. "Herbert, we are so sorry. We didn't know. We didn't understand." The spirit did not speak, but a voice filled their minds, soft and mournful, like the wind through the trees. "The darkness that took your daughter is older than I, older than this town. It is a hunger, a shadow that dwells in the heart of this forest, feeding on fear, on innocence. I sought to protect you, to keep it at bay, but in your fear, you condemned me. Tears streamed down Mary's face as she listened, her heart breaking. "Please, Herbert, tell us how we can save her. Tell us how to make this right." Herbert's gaze softened, his spectral hand reaching out to rest on her shoulder. "The only way to banish the darkness is to face it, to walk into its heart, and confront it without fear. You must descend into the place where shadows are born, where I once dared to go, and offer the truth that lies hidden within you." Father Donovan's voice shook as he spoke. Where must we go?" Herbert's form wavered, his face twisted in sorrow. "To the ancient stones at the heart of the forest. There, beneath the earth, lies the gateway to the place of shadows. It is a place of memories, of secrets, where the past lingers and the living are unwelcome. But be warned, only those willing to confront their own darkness may return." As his final words echoed through the night, Herbert's form dissolved, leaving them alone in the cold silence of the forest. The chill lingered, a reminder of his warning, of the path they must take. Mary looked at Father Donovan, her fear replaced by a grim determination. "We have to go, Father, for Agnes, for Herbert, and for the souls of everyone in Ettrick." Father Donovan nodded, his face pale but resolute. Together, they turned toward the heart of the forest, knowing that their journey was just beginning, and that whatever awaited them in the darkness was more than either of them could ever imagine. Chapter 5. The Heart of the Forest. The night was cold, a stillness settling over Ettrick as if the town itself was holding its breath. The forest loomed ahead, silent and dark, its depths shrouded in shadows that twisted and turned, hiding secrets older than memory. Mary and Father Donovan stood at the edge of the trees, their lantern casting a faint, trembling glow that barely penetrated the darkness. There was no turning back. They had followed Herbert's words, guided by the haunting message he had left them. Their only hope now lay within the ancient stones deep in the heart of the forest, a place that no one in Ettrick had dared to venture for as long as anyone could remember. Legends spoke of strange stones arranged in a circle, ancient monuments that predated the town itself, standing as silent witnesses to countless tragedies. As they stepped into the woods, the temperature seemed to drop, the chill sinking into their bones. Father Donovan held the lantern high, its flickering light illuminating gnarled trees and twisted roots that rose from the earth like skeletal hands. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the faint crunch of leaves beneath their feet and the occasional rustle of branches in the wind. "Are we doing the right thing, Father?" Mary's voice was barely a whisper, her face pale and drawn. Father Donovan looked at her, his expression weary but resolute. "I don't know, Mary. But if there's any chance of saving Agnes, of lifting the curse that we've brought upon ourselves, then we must try." They moved deeper into the forest, the trees closing in around them, their branches intertwining to form a dense canopy that blocked out the sky. Shadows danced at the edge of their vision, flickering in the lantern's light, and Mary could have sworn she saw faces among the trees. Hollow eyes staring back at her, mouths open in silent screams. She shivered, clutching her shawl tighter around her shoulders, feeling as though the forest itself was watching them, waiting. After what felt like hours of walking, they reached a small clearing. In the center stood the stones, tall, rough-hewn pillars arranged in a circle, their surfaces etched with strange, unreadable symbols that seemed to pulse with a faint, otherworldly light. The air was thick with an ancient energy, a sense of something powerful and dangerous that lay just beyond their understanding. Father Donovan held the lantern higher, illuminating the stones, their surfaces worn and cracked with age. The symbols glowed faintly, casting eerie shadows that seemed to shift and move on their own. He took a step forward, his voice barely a whisper. "This is it, the place Herbert spoke of." Mary took a deep breath, steeling herself. The sight of the stones filled her with a sense of dread, a feeling that she was standing at the edge of something dark and unfathomable. But she forced herself to move forward, stepping into the circle, her gaze fixed on the ancient symbols that seemed to watch her with an almost sentient awareness. As they stood within the circle, the air grew colder, the silence deeper, and then, without warning, a whisper filled the clearing, a soft, mournful sound that seemed to rise from the stones themselves, filling the air with a sorrow so deep It left them breathless. "Who dares disturb us?" The voice was ancient, filled with a weight of ages, echoing through the trees and vibrating in their bones. Mary and Father Donovan froze, their eyes wide with fear, their hearts pounding as the voice continued. "Why have you come to this place of shadows?" Father Donovan swallowed, his voice shaking as he stepped forward. "We seek to atone for what we've done. We seek to lift the curse, to save a child that was taken from us." The whisper grew louder, the air thickening with a dark, oppressive energy. Shadows swirled around the stones, coalescing into vague shapes. Figures that loomed in the darkness, watching them with hollow eyes that gleamed faintly in the lantern's light. "Your town is bound to the darkness. Your fear has awakened us. There is a price to be paid." Mary felt her heart skip a beat, her hands trembling as she clutched her shawl tighter. She could feel the weight of the figure's gaze, their hollow eyes piercing through her, filling her with a sense of despair that left her feeling hollow, empty. What is the price?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. The shadows shifted, their forms growing darker, more defined as the voice replied. "To break the curse, one must descend into the depths of memory, face the truth that lies hidden within." Father Donovan exchanged a glance with Mary, his expression grim. What truth must we face?" The voice was silent for a moment, as though considering his question. Then it replied, its tone colder, sharper. "The truth of your guilt, the darkness that festers in your hearts. Only by confronting your own shadows can you hope to save the innocent." Mary's breath caught in her throat as the words sank in. She understood then that this journey was not just about finding Agnes. It was about facing the darkness within themselves, the guilt and fear that had driven them to condemn an innocent man. But before she could speak, the shadows around the stones began to shift, swirling together to form a single figure, a tall, gaunt shape that loomed over them, its face hidden in darkness. She recognized it immediately. Herbert. His hollow eyes stared down at them, filled with a sorrow so deep it seemed to pierce her very soul. He raised a hand, pointing toward a narrow path that led deeper into the forest, his voice echoing in their minds. "Follow and face the truth that you hide." Mary and Father Donovan exchanged a glance, their faces pale but determined. They understood now that this journey would be more than just a search for Agnes. It would be a descent into the depths of their own guilt, their own fear. And if they could not confront it, if they could not face the shadows within themselves, then they would be lost to the darkness that had claimed their town. They turned and began walking down the path, the shadows closing in around them, the whisper of Herbert's voice echoing in their minds. As they walked, the forest grew darker, the trees twisting and contorting into grotesque shapes, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. Shadows danced at the edge of their vision, flickering in and out of existence, and the air grew thick with an oppressive weight that pressed down on them, filling their lungs with a cold, suffocating fear. The path led them to a deep ravine, the sides lined with jagged rocks and twisted roots that seemed to writhe and shift in the darkness. At the bottom lay a cave, its entrance gaping like the mouth of some ancient, hungry creature. The air around it was colder, heavier, filled with a sense of foreboding that made Mary's heart race. This is the place," Father Donovan whispered, his voice trembling. Mary nodded, her throat tight with fear. She could feel the darkness within the cave, a presence that seemed to watch them, waiting, but she knew they had no choice. If they wanted to save Agnes, if they wanted to lift the curse, they would have to enter the cave and face whatever horrors lay within. They stepped into the cave, the darkness swallowing them, the sound of their footsteps echoing off the cold stone walls. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decay, and the silence was so deep it seemed to press down on them, filling their minds with a sense of dread that grew with each step. As they moved deeper into the cave, strange sounds began to echo around them, whispers that seemed to come from every direction, voices that called out to them in tones of sorrow and despair. Mary could feel the weight of the voices pressing down on her, filling her with memories she had tried to bury, fears she had tried to forget. They reached a large chamber, the walls lined with strange symbols that glowed faintly in the darkness. At the center of the chamber stood a pool of water, its surface dark and still, reflecting the faint light of the symbols. The air around it was cold, filled with a heavy, oppressive energy that made Mary's skin prickle. The voice spoke again, filling the chamber with its mournful tone. To break the curse, you must look into the depths, face the darkness within, or be lost to it. Mary and Father Donovan exchanged a glance, their faces pale but determined. They stepped forward, standing at the edge of the pool, their reflections staring back at them from the dark, still water. As they looked into the pool, the surface began to ripple, shifting and changing to reveal scenes from their past, moments of fear, of anger, of guilt. Mary saw herself standing at the edge of the woods, accusing Herbert, her face twisted with fear and hatred. She saw the fire, the flames consuming his cabin, his pleading eyes staring back at her as the smoke filled the air. Father Donovan saw himself leading the townsfolk in prayer, his voice filled with righteous anger as he condemned Herbert, his own fear blinding him to the truth. He saw the shadows closing in around him, felt the weight of his guilt pressing down on him, suffocating him. They both knew then that the curse was not something cast upon them by Herbert. It was a manifestation of their own fear, their own hatred. They had created the darkness that now haunted Ettrick, and only by confronting it, by acknowledging their guilt, could they hope to banish it. They stood in silence, their reflections staring back at them. Chapter 6. A Descent into Shadows. Mary and Father Donovan stood side by side at the edge of the dark pool, the flickering light of the lantern casting shadows that twisted and warped on the walls of the ancient cave. The faces reflected in the water, strange, distorted versions of their own, seemed to stare back at them with hollow eyes. The very air around them was thick with dread, as though the walls themselves held the memories of every fearful soul who had ever ventured into this place. Father Donovan gripped the lantern tightly, its light dimming as the surrounding darkness seemed to absorb it. If we are to break the curse, Mary, we have to face what lies ahead. We must go deeper. Mary's voice trembled, her heart pounding as she gazed into the dark waters, deeper, into ourselves, into the sins we tried to bury. With a shared look of resolve, they stepped forward, plunging into the pool. The freezing water enveloped them, pulling them downward, and the world faded into blackness as they descended. Time lost meaning, and the silence was absolute, a suffocating void pressing down on them. And then, without warning, they were standing in the very heart of the curse. They found themselves in a twisted reflection of Ettrick, a place that looked like their village, but was stripped of all warmth and light. The streets were empty, shrouded in a thick mist that clung to their skin like cold hands. Buildings loomed in the shadows, their windows shattered and black, like empty eyes watching them. The air carried the scent of decay, and an eerie silence filled every corner, broken only by the faint whisper of unseen voices. Mary and Father Donovan looked around, their faces pale and drawn. They recognized the streets, the buildings, yet everything felt distorted, as if the town itself had been tainted by the darkness they had allowed to fester. It's Ettrick," Mary whispered, her voice barely audible. "But it's wrong. It's twisted." "This is Ettrick as it exists in the shadows," Father Donovan replied, his tone grim, "a reflection of the darkness we brought upon it." As they moved through the mist-filled streets, familiar faces began to materialize from the shadows. Villagers they knew, friends, family members, all twisted by sorrow and rage. Their eyes were empty, their expressions haunted, as though they were trapped in eternal suffering. They stared at Mary and Father Donovan with a mixture of accusation and sorrow, their voices low and filled with pain. "You brought this upon us," one of the figures whispered, its voice hollow and cold. "You fed the darkness with your fear, your hate." Another figure, its face twisted in grief, stepped forward, pointing a bony finger at them. "You judged without mercy. You turned against your own, and now we are bound to this place." Father Donovan's voice was thick with guilt as he responded, "We were wrong. We let fear rule us. We were blind to the truth. The shadows around them closed in, surrounding them, their voices a chorus of despair and accusation that echoed through the silent streets. Mary felt herself shrinking beneath their gazes, the weight of her guilt pressing down on her like a physical force. She could feel every hateful word she had spoken, every judgment she had passed, swirling around her, binding her to the darkness that had consumed Ettrick. One of the shadows drew closer, its face eerily familiar. It was the ghostly image of Agnes, her daughter, her face pale and hollow, her eyes wide and filled with sorrow. "Mother," the apparition whispered, its voice soft yet filled with accusation. "You abandoned me. You let fear blind you. You let it turn you into something unrecognizable." Mary's heart shattered as she looked into her daughter's eyes, her voice breaking. "Agnes, I'm so sorry. I didn't know. I didn't realize what I was doing." But the apparition's gaze was cold, unyielding. "Your fear became hatred, Mother. You fed the darkness that took me. Now, you must face it." The figures around them began to chant, their voices low and mournful, filling the air with a sorrow so deep it left Mary and Father Donovan gasping. The shadows twisted and writhed, merging together, forming a single massive shape, a towering figure cloaked in darkness, with eyes that burned like embers. The figure loomed over them, its presence filling the air with a suffocating weight. Its voice was a guttural whisper, echoing through their minds. "You who sought to purge the darkness, only to let it take root within yourselves. You must face the truth of what you are, or be lost to the shadows forever." Father Donovan's face was pale as he looked up at the towering figure, his voice trembling. "What? What must we do?" The figure's eyes blazed, its voice a harsh, unforgiving whisper. "You must descend into the heart of your own sins. Only by confronting the shadows within can you hope to break the chains that bind this place." The words sent a chill down Mary's spine, filling her with a sense of dread so profound it left her feeling hollow. She understood now that the curse was not just something that had been cast upon them. It was a manifestation of their own guilt, their own fear, a darkness that had grown stronger with each hateful act, each judgmental word. With a shuddering breath, Mary looked at Father Donovan, her voice barely above a whisper. "We have to go deeper, Father, into the heart of this place, and face what we've become." Together, they followed the shadowy figure, their steps slow and heavy, as though the weight of their sins was pressing down on them. The figure led them to the edge of a dark chasm, its depths hidden in shadow, an abyss that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. A faint, mournful wail rose from within, filling the air with a sorrow so deep it seemed to resonate with their very souls. The figure pointed into the chasm, its voice a cold, unforgiving whisper. "Enter, and confront the darkness within. Only then will you be free." Mary and Father Donovan exchanged a final glance, their faces pale but resolute. With a shared nod, they stepped into the chasm, the darkness swallowing them whole. And they found themselves in a place that was both familiar and alien, a twisted landscape that seemed to echo with the memories of every sin they had ever committed. The air was thick with a sense of despair and regret, and shadows loomed around them, watching, waiting. Images flickered before them, scenes from their own lives, each one a painful reminder of the fear and hatred they had allowed to take root. They saw themselves condemning Herbert, their faces twisted with suspicion and rage, their voices filled with accusations. They saw the townspeople gathered around Herbert's cabin, their faces lit by the flames that consumed him, their eyes filled with a cold, unfeeling hatred. As they watched, the shadows took shape, forming into twisted versions of themselves, their faces warped by fear and anger. The shadows stepped forward, their hollow eyes fixed on Mary and Father Donovan, their voices cold and accusing. "You fed the darkness, gave it strength. You let fear blind you, let hatred consume you. Now, you are bound to it." The words cut through them like a knife, filling them with a despair so deep it felt as though they were being hollowed out, their very souls exposed to the darkness that surrounded them. But even in the depths of their despair, a spark of hope remained. They understood now that the curse was not some external force. It was a reflection of their own sins, a darkness they had created and allowed to grow. And if they could confront it, if they could face the truth of what they had done, perhaps they could finally break free. With a shuddering breath, Mary stepped forward, her voice trembling but determined. We were wrong. We let fear rule us, let it turn us into something monstrous, but we will not let it consume us any longer. Father Donovan joined her, his voice filled with a quiet strength. We will face the darkness we created, and we will make amends. The shadows around them shifted, their accusing gazes softening, and the oppressive weight in the air began to lift. The towering figure that had led them here watched, its blazing eyes dimming, as though it too recognized the sincerity of their repentance. The darkness around them began to recede, the shadows dissolving, and a faint light appeared at the edge of their vision, growing brighter with each passing moment. They could feel the weight lifting from their hearts, the curse weakening as they confronted the darkness within themselves. Hand in hand, they walked toward the light, leaving the shadows behind, and for the first time, they felt a sense of peace, a hope that perhaps they had finally found a way to break the curse and save Ettrick. As they stepped into the light, the twisted landscape faded, replaced by the familiar sights of their village, the morning sun breaking through the mist, casting a warm glow over the town. They had returned to Ettrick, but they were no longer bound by the darkness that had once held them captive. They knew that their journey was not over, that there were still amends to be made, wrongs to be righted, but they had faced the shadows within, and in doing so, they had taken the first step toward redemption. Chapter 7. Echoes of the Abyss. The morning sun cast a feeble light over Ettrick, but even its warm glow couldn't shake the chill that lingered in Mary's bones. She and Father Donovan had emerged from the heart of the curse, but the shadows of that dark realm clung to them, unseen yet heavy, filling the air with an eerie silence. Though they had faced the darkness within themselves and taken the first steps toward redemption, the weight of their journey was far from over. They moved through the town, their steps slow and heavy, feeling the eyes of the townsfolk on them. Whispers rippled through the crowd, soft murmurs filled with suspicion and fear. Mary could feel their gaze, see the unease in their faces as they looked upon her and Father Donovan, as if they carried some strange, invisible taint. It was as though the darkness they had confronted in the abyss had marked them, left an invisible shadow that others could sense. Father Donovan's face was pale, his eyes filled with a haunted, distant look. He clutched his rosary tightly, his fingers brushing each bead as he muttered prayers under his breath. But even his words of faith seemed weak against the lingering dread that had settled over Ettrick. As they passed the ruined remains of Herbert's cabin, Mary stopped, staring at the charred wood and blackened earth. The place felt alive, pulsing with a dark energy that made her skin prickle. She could still feel Herbert's sorrow, his anger, the sense of betrayal that had bound him to this place. It was as though his spirit was watching, waiting for them to take the final steps to make amends. "We may have faced the darkness within," Mary murmured, "but Herbert's spirit is still here. He hasn't left, Father. Not yet." Father Donovan nodded, his voice a hushed whisper. "I feel it too. The echoes of what we did linger in this place, haunting it like a wound that hasn't healed." The wind stirred, rustling the scorched remains of the cabin, and Mary thought she heard a faint whisper, a voice on the wind that sounded like Herbert's. Her heart pounded, a chill running down her spine as she strained to hear the words. They were faint, almost lost in the breeze, but one word cut through the silence, clear and undeniable. Agnes. The name struck Mary like a blow, filling her with a renewed sense of urgency. She turned to Father Donovan, her eyes wide. "He said her name. I heard it. He's still searching for her." Father Donovan nodded slowly, a look of grim understanding in his eyes. "Then our work isn't over. Herbert's spirit cannot rest until we bring Agnes back, or at least find out what happened to her." With a renewed sense of purpose, they decided to search the forest where Agnes had disappeared, hoping to find any remaining clue that could lead them to her. The forest loomed before them, its twisted branches casting long shadows that seemed to shift and writhe as they stepped deeper into its depths. The silence grew thick, oppressive, pressing down on them as they ventured further from the town. Every sound seemed amplified, each crack of a twig or rustle of leaves sending a shiver through Mary's spine. It was as though the forest itself was alive, watching them, waiting for something. They followed the faint path that led toward the clearing where they had last seen Agnes, the air growing colder with each step. After a time, they reached the clearing, a small desolate space surrounded by twisted trees. The light barely penetrated the thick canopy above, casting a gloomy, sepulchral glow over the ground. Mary knelt, her fingers brushing the earth, searching for any sign of Agnes's presence, any trace of the child who had been lost. And then, her hand brushed against something small, cold and metallic. She lifted it, her heart pounding as she recognized the object. A tiny, rusted locket, its surface scratched and worn. She remembered the day she had given it to Agnes, a birthday gift, a token of love. "Father," she whispered, holding up the locket, her voice trembling. "It's hers. She was here." Father Donovan knelt beside her, his expression grave as he examined the locket. "Then we're close. If we can find where she went from here, perhaps we can find a way to end this." They rose, their eyes scanning the clearing, searching for any sign, any hint of where Agnes might have gone. But the forest seemed to resist them, its shadows growing thicker, its silence heavier, as though it were trying to hide something, to keep them from uncovering the truth. And then they saw it, a faint trail leading deeper into the woods, barely visible, overgrown with thorny vines and twisted roots. It looked like it hadn't been touched in years, as though it had been hidden, forgotten. But Mary felt a strange pull toward it, a compulsion she couldn't explain. "This way," she murmured, her voice barely audible. She took a step onto the path, feeling the weight of the forest pressing down on her, urging her to turn back. But she pushed forward, her mind fixed on Agnes, on the daughter she had lost. Father Donovan followed, his face pale, his hand clutching the rosary tightly as he whispered prayers. The air grew colder, each step deeper into the woods filling them with a growing sense of dread, as though they were descending into some dark, forbidden place. The path led them to a small hidden glen, surrounded by ancient, towering trees that seemed to form a natural barrier around it. The ground was covered in strange markings, symbols carved into the earth, their lines twisting and intersecting in patterns that seemed both chaotic and deliberate. At the center of the glen stood a stone altar, its surface worn and weathered, covered in moss and dark stains that made Mary's stomach twist with unease. Father Donovan's voice was barely a whisper as he gazed at the altar. "This place, it's older than the town itself. A site of ritual, perhaps, or sacrifice." Mary's heart pounded, her gaze fixed on the altar. She could feel a dark energy emanating from it, a presence that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. It was as though the altar were a doorway, a portal to something ancient and malevolent that lay just beyond their understanding. And then, from the shadows, they heard a voice, a low, mournful whisper that filled the air with sorrow and despair. It was Herbert's voice, faint but unmistakable, resonating with the energy of the place. "They took her here, to this place of shadows. She is lost, bound to the darkness, just as I am." Mary's breath caught in her throat, her heart pounding as the meaning of Herbert's words sank in. Agnes hadn't simply vanished. She had been taken, drawn into the shadows by the same darkness that had claimed Herbert, a force older than the town itself, something that fed on fear and sorrow. We have to bring her back," Mary whispered, her voice trembling. "We have to free her." Father Donovan nodded, his expression grim. "But how? This place? It is not of this world. It's a place of shadows, a doorway to something beyond." The air around them grew colder, the shadows thickening, pressing down on them with a weight that felt almost physical. They could feel the presence of the darkness, a force that had lurked beneath Ettrick for generations, waiting for those who would feed it with fear and hatred. In desperation, Mary knelt before the altar, clutching the locket tightly in her hands, her voice breaking as she spoke. Please, if you are here, if you can hear me, I beg you, return my daughter. Take my life if you must, but release her. She's just a child." The silence stretched, heavy and oppressive, and for a moment, Mary thought her words had gone unanswered. But then, the shadows began to shift, swirling around the altar, forming into a figure, a faint, ghostly image of Agnes, her face pale and sorrowful, her eyes filled with a sadness beyond her years. "Mother." Agnes's voice was barely a whisper, filled with a sorrow that cut through Mary's heart. "I am here, but I am bound. The darkness holds me, feeds on my fear. It will not let me go." Mary reached out, tears streaming down her face. "Agnes, my darling, I'm so sorry. I should have protected you. I should have seen the truth." Agnes's image flickered, her voice a faint echo. "The darkness, it feeds on fear. It will not release us until the fear is gone." Father Donovan's face grew pale as he realized the truth. "We must let go of our fear, our hatred. Only then can we break the hold this place has on us and free her." Together, they knelt before the altar, their hands clasped, their voices filled with desperation and resolve as they prayed, letting go of their fear, their anger, every dark emotion that had bound them to the curse. The shadows around them began to dissipate, the weight lifting as the darkness released its hold, the air growing lighter, warmer. Agnes's image faded, her face peaceful, her voice a soft whisper. "Thank you, Mother. I am free." And as her voice faded into the silence, Mary and Father Donovan felt a sense of peace settle over them, a warmth that filled the glen, banishing the shadows and bringing light to the place of darkness. They had faced the abyss, and in doing Chapter 7, the binding shadows. The afternoon light filtering through the canopy was dim, and as Mary and Father Donovan made their way deeper into the forest, it seemed to thin even further, swallowed by the encroaching darkness of the trees. The silence was absolute, punctuated only by the crunch of leaves beneath their feet and the faint rustle of branches, as though the forest were whispering secrets to itself. The air felt thick, each breath heavy, like they were stepping further into a different realm. They had uncovered Agnes's locket at the edge of a hidden path, overgrown with thorny vines and twisted roots. The discovery had felt like both a sign and a warning, a call for them to venture into places no one in Ettrick dared to go. "Do you feel it, Father?" Mary whispered, her voice barely audible. Father Donovan nodded solemnly. "Yes, the forest itself feels alive, as though it's watching us, waiting. It's as if we're nearing the heart of whatever has claimed Agnes." Mary clenched the locket tightly in her hand, feeling its chill against her palm, her heart filled with a steely resolve. They continued down the narrow path, moving deeper into the heart of the woods. The air grew colder, the light dimming further until the world around them was cast in eerie twilight. Shadows clung to the trees, their forms twisting and shifting in ways that felt unnatural, as though they were not bound by the laws of reality. The forest led them to a clearing encircled by ancient, towering trees that seemed to lean inward, as if to keep whatever lay within concealed. At the center of the clearing stood a stone altar, its surface weathered and covered in strange symbols that pulsed with a faint, sickly glow. The ground around the altar was marked with faded sigils, twisted and tangled, symbols that seemed to hum with an energy that was both ancient and malevolent. A wave of dread washed over Mary and Father Donovan as they approached the altar. The air around it was colder, the silence heavier, as though the clearing existed in a separate reality where time and light held no meaning. It was a place of ritual, of shadows, a gateway to a darkness that had existed long before Ettrick was ever founded. Father Donovan crossed himself, his face pale, his voice a mere whisper. "This place, it feels like a wound in the earth itself, as if something unspeakable happened here and left a stain on the land." Mary shivered, feeling a sense of dread settling in her bones. Do you think this is where they took her?" Father Donovan's gaze was fixed on the altar, his eyes filled with a grim understanding. "It's possible. This place is ancient, a place of sacrifice. Whatever darkness resides here, it may have taken her, bound her to it." As they stood before the altar, the silence was broken by a soft, almost inaudible whisper that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. The words were distorted, as if they were being spoken from the other side of a veil, a barrier between worlds. "Mother! Father! Help me!" Mary's heart seized, her voice a broken whisper. "Agnes!" Her voice hung in the air, swallowed by the shadows, and for a moment there was nothing but silence. But then, the shadows around the altar began to shift, coalescing into a figure, a faint, ghostly image of Agnes, her face pale, her eyes hollow and sorrowful. She looked at Mary with an expression of unending grief, a sadness that seemed to pierce Mary's soul. "Agnes," Mary whispered, her voice trembling. She reached out, her hand shaking. "Oh, my darling, I'm here. I'm so sorry. I didn't protect you." Agnes's ghostly form flickered, her voice a faint, mournful whisper that filled the air with a sorrow so deep it seemed to resonate with the earth itself. "The darkness, it holds me, feeds on my fear. It won't let me go." The words filled Mary with a sense of horror so profound it left her breathless. Her daughter was trapped, bound to this place by a force older and darker than anything she could comprehend. It was a force that fed on fear, on despair, a malevolent energy that had been waiting, lurking in the shadows, feeding on the pain and suffering of those who dared to approach. Father Donovan stepped forward, his face set with determination. "We won't leave you here, Agnes. We'll free you, no matter what it takes." The ghostly figure of Agnes looked at them, her expression unreadable, as though she were caught between two worlds, held by a force that would not release her. The air around them grew colder, and the shadows thickened, pressing down on them with a weight that was almost unbearable. Suddenly the ground beneath them began to tremble, a low rumble that grew louder, more intense, as if the earth itself were groaning in agony. The shadows around the altar shifted, twisting and writhing, and from the darkness, a figure began to emerge. It was tall, impossibly thin, its form cloaked in shadows that seemed to ripple and shift like a living thing. Its face was hidden, but its eyes burned with a cold, malevolent light, a gaze that seemed to pierce through Mary and Father Donovan, filling them with a sense of dread so intense it left them frozen in place. The figure's voice was a harsh whisper, a sound that was both ancient and unnatural, as though it had been born from the darkness itself. "You, who brought fear to this place, who let hatred fester, you are bound to me." Father Donovan swallowed, his voice shaking. We came to set her free, We won't leave her to this darkness." The figure's gaze turned to Mary, its eyes cold and unfeeling. "She is mine, as are you. You fed the darkness with your fear, your hatred. You gave it strength, allowed it to take root. You are bound by your own shadows." Mary felt a surge of despair, her heart sinking as the weight of the figure's words washed over her. She knew, deep down, that it was right. She had allowed her fear to consume her, to cloud her judgment, and in doing so, she had given power to the darkness that now held her daughter captive. But even in the depths of her despair, a spark of determination remained. She would not leave Agnes to this fate, would not allow her daughter to be lost to the shadows. With a deep breath, she stepped forward, her voice filled with a quiet, unyielding resolve. "I may have fed this darkness, but I won't let it keep my daughter. I will do whatever it takes to free her, even if it means facing the shadows within myself." The figure's gaze bore into her, its cold eyes seeming to see into the depths of her soul. "Then descend into the heart of your own darkness. Only by confronting the fear within can you break the chains that bind you." The shadows around them began to swirl, forming a vortex that pulled them into its depths. Mary and Father Donovan felt themselves sinking, descending into a darkness that was both familiar and terrifying. They were no longer in the forest, no longer in the clearing. They were in a place of shadows, a realm where their deepest fears, their darkest memories, were laid bare. They stood in the heart of Ettrick, but it was a twisted, nightmarish version of the town, a place where the buildings loomed like spectres, their windows dark and empty. The air was thick with the scent of decay, and the silence was filled with whispers, faint, mocking voices that echoed through the streets, filled with sorrow and accusation. As they moved through the twisted streets, familiar faces appeared in the shadows. Villagers they had known, friends, family members, all twisted by fear and hatred. Their eyes were hollow, their expressions filled with accusation and grief. One by one, the villagers stepped forward, their voices low and filled with anger. "You brought this upon us, allowed the darkness to grow, let fear rule you. You turned against your own, fed the shadows that now consume us all." Each word cut through Mary and Father Donovan like a knife, filling them with a sense of guilt and shame so deep it left them gasping for breath. They could feel the weight of their sins pressing down on them. The darkness they had allowed to fester within themselves now reflected in the twisted forms of their friends and loved ones. Mary fell to her knees, her voice a broken whisper. "I'm so sorry. I didn't mean for this to happen. I was afraid, and I let that fear blind me." The shadows closed in around her, their hollow eyes filled with accusation. Fear is no excuse. Hatred, no justification. You must face what you have become, or be lost to the darkness forever. Father Donovan knelt beside her, his hands trembling as he whispered a prayer, his voice filled with desperation. "We were wrong. We let fear rule us. But we want to make amends. We want to set things right." The shadows shifted, their forms merging, twisting into a single, towering figure that loomed over them, its hollow gaze filled with a sorrow so deep it seemed to pierce their very souls. To break the curse, you must release the fear within. Only by confronting your own shadows can you hope to save her, and yourselves. With a final, shared look of determination, Mary and Father Donovan rose to their feet, their gazes fixed on the towering figure before them. They understood now that the darkness that had taken Agnes, that had bound Ettrick, was not an external force. It was a reflection of their own fears, a manifestation of the hatred and suspicion they had allowed to grow. They took each other's hands, stepping forward together, their voices filled with resolve as they faced the shadows within. They spoke their fears, their regrets, confessing every sin, every moment of hatred and suspicion that had bound them to the darkness. As they spoke, the shadows around them began to dissipate, the weight lifting, the air growing lighter. They could feel the curse weakening, its hold loosening as they released the fear within themselves, as they faced the darkness they had allowed to take root. And then, as the last of the shadows faded, they saw her, Agnes, standing in the light, her face peaceful, her eyes filled with gratitude. "Mother, Father, thank you." Her voice was soft, filled with a warmth that washed over them, banishing the last of the shadows. Mary's heart swelled with relief, tears streaming down her face as she reached out to her daughter, pulling her into an embrace. They had faced the darkness, confronted the shadows within, and in doing so, they had broken the chains that bound them. The curse had been lifted, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, they felt a sense of peace, a lightness that filled the air, banishing the shadows from Ettrick forever. Chapter 8. The Return of the Shadow. As dawn broke over Ettrick, Mary and Father Donovan felt the lingering chill of their journey into the heart of darkness, the burden of their shared secrets pressing down on them. They had confronted the shadows within themselves, and, in doing so, freed Agnes from the grasp of the curse that had haunted the town for generations. But as the first light of day crept through the trees, casting long, pale shadows across the ground, an unease settled over them, a sense that their victory was not yet complete. Though they had seen Agnes safe, though her spirit had appeared at peace, a sense of something unfinished gnawed at Mary's mind. The town still felt heavy, wrapped in an oppressive silence that suggested a presence waiting, watching, and as they stepped back into the village, they could feel eyes upon them, the weight of generations bearing down, as though the land itself remembered every sin, every betrayal, every moment of despair that had led to the curse. Father Donovan's voice was low, filled with worry. "Mary, do you feel it? The air is wrong. This doesn't feel like the release we hoped for." Mary nodded, her face pale. "It's as if something is holding on, like a shadow refusing to let go. I thought we had broken the curse, but it feels as though it's only hiding, lurking beneath the surface." The townsfolk, who had seen them return from the forest, began to gather around them. Their faces were marked with exhaustion, their eyes filled with a fear they had grown accustomed to. It was a fear that had taken root in their souls, bound them to the darkness, even as they prayed for freedom. An elderly woman stepped forward, her voice quavering. "Did you find her? Did you release her?" Mary's gaze fell to the ground. "We saw her. Agnes. She's at peace. But—" She hesitated, feeling the weight of the town's expectations pressing down on her. "But I'm afraid something else still lingers. It's as if the curse has one last hold on Ettrick." A murmur rippled through the crowd, a mixture of relief and anxiety. They had lived so long with the shadows, felt the touch of darkness in every corner of their lives, that the thought of a lingering curse was almost more than they could bear. Father Donovan raised his hands, calling for calm. "We have faced much, but this is not the end. We must remain vigilant. We must ensure that no shadow, no whisper of fear remains in our hearts. Only then can we truly be free." But even as he spoke, a low, almost imperceptible hum began to fill the air, a sound that seemed to come from the ground itself, a deep, resonant vibration that sent a shiver through the gathered crowd. The villagers glanced around nervously, their faces growing pale as the hum grew louder, filling the air with an otherworldly energy. Suddenly, the ground beneath them began to tremble, a slow, rhythmic pulse that seemed to echo the beat of a massive heart. The trees around them swayed, their branches creaking and groaning as if moved by an unseen force. And then, without warning, a thick, choking fog began to rise from the earth, swirling around them, filling the air with a cold, suffocating presence. Mary's heart pounded, her breath coming in short gasps as the fog thickened, obscuring her vision. She reached for Father Donovan, her hand trembling as she clutched his arm. "Father, what's happening? We broke the curse, didn't we?" Father Donovan's face was pale, his eyes wide with terror as he stared into the fog. "I don't know, Mary, but whatever we did, it wasn't enough. There's something more, something we didn't see." As they stood in the swirling fog, a voice echoed through the air, a deep, rumbling whisper that seemed to come from the very heart of the earth. It was a voice filled with ancient malice, a darkness that had lain hidden for centuries, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. "You thought you could banish me, but I am older than your town, older than the forest, older than the stones beneath your feet. I am the darkness that dwells within you, and I will never leave." The voice filled the air, a sound so profound it seemed to vibrate in their bones, a voice that was both terrifyingly familiar and utterly alien. Mary felt a chill run down her spine, her heart pounding with a fear so deep it left her breathless. She realized with a dawning horror that the curse was not just a spell or a presence bound to the land, it was something woven into the fabric of Ettrick itself, a darkness that had grown stronger with every act of fear, every betrayal, every whispered accusation. The fog began to coalesce, forming shapes, twisted figures that writhed and shifted, their faces distorted with expressions of pain and rage. Mary recognized them, the faces of the townsfolk, twisted by fear and suspicion, their eyes hollow, their mouths open in silent screams. One of the figures stepped forward, its hollow gaze fixed on Mary. She recognized the face. It was her own, twisted and distorted, her eyes filled with an unending sorrow, a reflection of the fear and hatred she had harbored within herself. "You created me," the figure whispered, its voice filled with accusation. "You gave me life with your fear, your hatred, your rage. I am the darkness within you, and I will never leave." Mary stumbled back, her heart pounding as she stared at the twisted version of herself. The weight of her sins, her guilt, pressed down on her, filling her with a despair so deep it left her feeling hollow. Father Donovan took her hand, his voice a low, desperate whisper. "Mary, we must let go. We must release every fear, every hatred, every regret that binds us to this darkness." Together they knelt on the ground, their hands clasped, their voices trembling as they began to pray. They prayed for forgiveness, for release from the darkness that had consumed them, for the strength to let go of the fears and hatred that had bound them to the curse. As they prayed, the fog around them began to waver, the twisted figures flickering, their forms growing faint. The ground beneath them trembled, a low, ominous rumble that seemed to come from the depths of the earth itself. The voice echoed once more, filled with a rage that shook the air. You cannot escape me. I am a part of you. As long as there is fear in your heart, I will live. But Mary and Father Donovan continued to pray, their voices filled with a quiet, unyielding resolve. They let go of every fear, every hatred, every regret, releasing the darkness within themselves, banishing it from their souls. The fog began to dissipate, the twisted figures fading into nothingness, and the air grew lighter, the oppressive weight lifting as the darkness released its hold. But even as the last of the fog faded, Mary felt a lingering presence, a faint, malevolent whisper that filled the air with a sense of unending sorrow. And then, in the silence that followed, a final figure appeared. Herbert's spirit, his face filled with an expression of profound sadness, his eyes fixed on Mary and Father Donovan. You did well, Herbert whispered, his voice filled with a sorrow so deep it seemed to echo through the trees. But the darkness will never truly leave. It is bound to this land, to the hearts of those who live here. It will wait, and one day, it will return. Mary's heart ached as she looked into Herbert's hollow eyes, her voice a broken whisper. Is there nothing we can do, Herbert? Nothing to keep it from returning? Herbert shook his head, his gaze distant, filled with a sorrow that seemed to stretch back through the ages. The darkness is a part of this place, a part of every soul who carries fear and hatred in their hearts. As long as those emotions exist, the darkness will find a way. Father Donovan's face was pale, his voice a whisper. Then we are never free, are we? Herbert's gaze softened, a faint smile touching his lips. You are free, as long as you choose to be. The darkness can only take hold if you allow it. Live without fear, without hatred, and the shadows will remain at bay. With those final words, Herbert's spirit faded, dissolving into the morning light, leaving Mary and Father Donovan alone in the clearing. They rose, their faces marked by exhaustion and sorrow, but also by a sense of peace. They knew that the darkness would always be there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to return. But they also knew that they had the power to keep it at bay, to live without fear, without hatred, to choose light over darkness. As they walked back to Ettrick, the morning sun broke through the clouds, casting a warm golden light over the village. The air felt lighter, the oppressive weight of the curse lifted, and for the first time in years, the people of Ettrick felt a sense of hope. But in the depths of the forest, hidden among the twisted roots and ancient stones, the darkness waited, biding its time, watching. Chapter 9. The Gathering Shadows. As Mary and Father Donovan returned to the village under the bright morning sun, a subtle heaviness clung to the air, casting a shadow over the fleeting sense of peace they had found. Though they had lifted the curse from Agnes's spirit and banished the visible darkness from Ettrick, an eerie silence had descended over the town, as if the very land were holding its breath. Whispers of the curse's legacy lingered like smoke, haunting the minds of the villagers, even those who had never spoken Herbert's name aloud. Mary moved through the town square, feeling eyes upon her as the villagers gathered, curious but wary. Some looked to her with hope, others with suspicion, still haunted by the shadows they had been forced to face within themselves. Father Donovan addressed the crowd, his voice firm but heavy with exhaustion. The darkness that held this town has been pushed back, but it has not disappeared. It's bound to this land, to our hearts. We must keep watch, must hold ourselves accountable so that fear and hatred do not give it strength again. The people murmured, shifting uneasily, their gazes lingering on the shadows cast by the rising sun. It was clear that many were relieved, yet haunted by an unshakable dread, a lingering sense that the darkness had only retreated, lying in wait just beyond the edge of the woods. Mary's gaze drifted toward the forest, where the trees swayed gently in the wind, their branches casting twisted shadows on the ground. She felt a pull toward it, a compulsion she couldn't explain, as if something was calling her back. Her thoughts turned to Agnes, to the promise she had made to keep the darkness from returning. Yet a small voice inside her whispered that they had only temporarily pacified it, that the shadows would never fully disappear. Later that evening, as the villagers dispersed and returned to their homes, Mary and Father Donovan met at the edge of the forest, their faces drawn and weary. "We may have lifted the curse from Agnes, but the land itself still feels restless," Mary said, her voice barely above a whisper. Father Donovan nodded, his expression troubled. "Herbert warned us that the darkness would never fully leave. It's as if we've simply pushed it into hiding, and it's waiting for the first opportunity to return." Mary shivered, feeling the weight of his words settle over her like a shroud. "Then what do we do, Father? We can't live our lives in fear of it returning. How can we protect the town?" Father Donovan gazed into the forest, his eyes thoughtful. "Perhaps we need to understand its origins. If we can learn how this darkness first came to Ettrick, we may find a way to seal it for good." A chill ran down Mary's spine at the thought of delving into the town's past, of uncovering secrets that had been buried for generations. Yet she knew that it was the only way forward, the only way to ensure that the curse did not resurface. That night, Mary and Father Donovan returned to the church, gathering any records they could find about the town's history. They pored over dusty tomes, old journals, and fading letters by candlelight, searching for any mention of the darkness, any hint of how it had taken root in Ettrick. As they read, they began to piece together a story that had been all but forgotten, a tale of betrayal, fear, and hidden sins that had stained the very soul of the town. Centuries ago, before Ettrick had been founded, the land had belonged to a small, secluded village hidden within the forest. The villagers had lived simple, peaceful lives, but they had harboured a deep fear of the forest itself, believing it to be home to ancient spirits, both benevolent and malevolent. According to their beliefs, these spirits guarded the land, demanding respect and appeasement through rituals and offerings. One fateful year, however, the village suffered a terrible famine, leaving them desperate and vulnerable. The villagers began to question their faith in the spirits, wondering if they had been abandoned or betrayed. A small group of villagers, driven by fear and anger, decided to take matters into their own hands. They defied the ancient customs, venturing deep into the forest and tearing down the altars and stones that had been sacred to their ancestors. Their defiance awakened something deep within the land, a malevolent force that had been bound to the forest by ancient rites. Without the altars to contain it, the darkness was unleashed, spreading like a poison through the village, twisting the minds and hearts of those it touched. Fear turned to hatred, hatred to violence, and within weeks, the village tore itself apart, consumed by suspicion and rage. As the village fell into ruin, those who survived fled, leaving the cursed land behind. But the darkness remained, lingering in the shadows, waiting for the next opportunity to take root in the hearts of those who would settle on the land. Mary shivered as she read the final lines of the account, her heart pounding with a sense of horror and despair. The darkness was not just a curse, it was a living entity, a malevolent force that thrived on fear and hatred, feeding on the weaknesses of the human soul. Father Donovan closed the book, his face pale. The darkness was bound by rites we can no longer perform, by altars and stones that no longer exist. We've stirred it once more by our own actions, by the fear that has lingered in Ettrick for generations. Mary swallowed, her voice trembling. Then we're trapped. It's as if the land itself is cursed, and we're just the latest victims. Father Donovan shook his head, his gaze firm. We may be bound to this land, but that doesn't mean we have to surrender to the darkness. If the rights have been lost, we must create our own way to protect the town. We must find a way to keep the darkness from feeding on our fears. In the days that followed, Mary and Father Donovan worked tirelessly, calling upon the townsfolk to join them in rituals of their own making, rituals of cleansing, of unity, of banishing fear and hatred from their hearts. Each evening, they gathered in the town square, standing hand in hand, praying and chanting, filling the air with words of peace and light. But as the sun set each night, casting long shadows over the village, Mary couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The air grew colder, the wind harsher, as though the darkness itself was pushing back against their efforts, testing their resolve. One evening, as the villagers gathered for their nightly ritual, a thick fog began to rise from the ground, swirling around them, filling the air with a cold, suffocating presence. The villagers huddled together, their voices trembling as they continued to chant, their words growing louder, more desperate. The fog thickened, forming shapes that twisted and writhed, faces emerging from the mist, faces twisted by fear and hatred, hollow eyes staring back at them with expressions of accusation and sorrow. One of the figures stepped forward, its gaze fixed on Mary. She recognized the face. It was her own, twisted and distorted, her eyes filled with a darkness that made her heart pound with terror. The figure's voice was a harsh whisper, filled with malice. "You cannot escape me. I am the darkness within you, the fear you hide, the hatred you deny. I will always be here, waiting." Mary stumbled back, her heart racing as the figure moved closer, its hollow eyes piercing into her soul, filling her with a sense of despair so deep it left her breathless. Father Donovan stepped forward, his voice strong and steady as he raised his hands in defiance. "We are not bound to you. We choose light over darkness, unity over fear. You have no power here," the figure hissed, its form wavering as the villagers' voices rose in a crescendo, their chants filling the air with a warmth that pushed back against the cold, oppressive presence of the fog. But even as the fog began to dissipate, the figure's voice echoed through the night, a final, haunting whisper that sent a chill through their bones. "I am the shadow in every heart, the fear in every mind. You may drive me back, but I will always return. I am bound to this land, and to you." The fog faded, leaving the village in an uneasy silence, the weight of the figure's words lingering in the air. Mary and Father Donovan exchanged a glance, their faces pale, their hearts heavy with the knowledge that their battle was far from over. The darkness had been driven back, but it was not defeated. It would wait, lying dormant, feeding on every whisper of fear, every flicker of hatred, until it found the strength to rise once more. As the villagers dispersed, their faces filled with a quiet determination, Mary felt a renewed sense of purpose. They would keep watch, would guard their hearts against the darkness, would fill their lives with light and unity. But as she looked out at the shadowed edges of the forest, she couldn't shake the feeling that the darkness was watching, waiting, biding its time. And though she had faced her own fears, her own shadows, she knew that it would take only the smallest crack in their defenses for the darkness to return, stronger and hungrier than ever before. Ettrick was free for now. But the shadow remained, a silent presence on the edge of the forest, waiting for the next soul to falter, the next heart to waver. And in the silence that followed, Mary knew that their fight was far from over. Chapter 10. The Shadow Returns. Days turned into weeks, and the village of Ettrick breathed a sigh of relief, believing they had finally exorcised the darkness that had plagued them for generations. Mary and Father Donovan worked tirelessly to rebuild the community, hosting gatherings that celebrated unity and light. Each evening, the townsfolk would gather in the square, sharing stories, laughter, and hope, their voices echoing against the twilight sky. Yet, beneath the surface of this fragile tranquility, an insidious tension thrummed, a pulse that resonated with the shadows lurking just beyond the trees. Mary couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every rustle in the underbrush, every whisper of the wind through the trees sent a shiver down her spine. The forest, once a place of beauty, had transformed into a dark entity, its branches intertwining like gnarled fingers, reaching out to the town, as if trying to reclaim what it had lost. Despite her fear, Mary refused to show weakness. She worked hard to bolster the villagers' spirits, organizing nightly vigils to keep the darkness at bay. They lit candles and hung lanterns around the square, their warm glow fighting against the encroaching shadows. But with each passing day, the light felt dimmer, as though the darkness was seeping in, stealing away their resolve. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting an ominous glow over the forest, Mary felt a surge of anxiety rise within her. The atmosphere was charged, electric with an unseen tension that gripped her heart. The villagers gathered as usual, but their laughter was strained, their eyes darting nervously toward the tree line. Father Donovan stood before them, his expression grave. "We must remain vigilant. The darkness may be lurking, waiting for the moment we let our guard down." As he spoke, a low rumble echoed through the air, a sound that seemed to come from deep within the forest. It was an unnatural sound, a growl that reverberated through the trees, sending a chill through the crowd. The villagers exchanged fearful glances, their hands trembling as the wind picked up, swirling leaves and debris around them. Mary felt her heart race as the shadows along the tree line thickened, twisting and coiling as if alive. She glanced at Father Donovan, who stood frozen, his gaze fixed on the encroaching darkness. The unease that had been building within her erupted into full-blown panic. "Everyone! We need to retreat to the church!" Mary shouted, her voice cutting through the tension. "We must protect ourselves from whatever is coming." The villagers scrambled, their faces pale with fear as they hurried toward the church, their hearts pounding with dread. Mary felt the cold press of shadows at her back, a palpable sense of malevolence that made her skin crawl. As they reached the church, the heavy wooden doors creaked open, and they poured inside, the warmth of the lanterns casting flickering light against the oppressive darkness. Father Donovan hurried to the front, gathering the townsfolk in a tight circle, his voice urgent and commanding. "Close the doors! Bar them! We must not let the darkness in!" With trembling hands, the villagers obeyed, slamming the doors shut and securing them with iron bolts. The sense of safety within the church felt fragile, as though the walls were mere paper against the darkness looming just outside. They gathered in the dim light, their eyes wide with terror, as the growl from the forest grew louder, resonating through the walls, a deep rumbling sound that shook the very foundation of the building. "Father," Mary whispered, her voice trembling, "what if it's true? What if the darkness has returned?" Father Donovan's expression was grave as he surveyed the frightened faces around him. "We must remember what we learned. The darkness thrives on fear. We cannot let it consume us again. We must stand united and face it." But as he spoke, the air thickened, the shadows creeping closer, inching their way into the sanctuary. The flickering lanterns struggled to push back the darkness, casting elongated shadows that danced along the walls like phantoms. Suddenly, the growl morphed into a roar, a sound so primal, so filled with rage, that it sent everyone reeling back in terror. The doors shuddered violently, the sound of scratching claws echoing as something on the other side sought to break through. The villagers screamed, their fear palpable, as they clung to one another. Mary's heart raced, and she felt the ground tremble beneath her feet, as if the very earth was responding to the presence outside. She could sense the darkness closing in, a weight pressing against the doors, threatening to spill into their sanctuary. "Father, we have to do something," she cried, her voice rising above the panic. "We can't just sit here." He nodded, determination flooding his features. "We must light the candles, strengthen our resolve. We'll invoke the blessings of our ancestors, and together we can drive it back." Mary rushed to the altar, her hands trembling as she grabbed a candle and lit it, its flame flickering valiantly against the growing darkness. Father Donovan joined her, lighting more candles as the townsfolk followed suit, creating a circle of light that pushed back against the encroaching shadows. As they lit the candles, a soft, ghostly whisper filled the church, an echo of the past that resonated with both sorrow and strength. "You are not alone. Remember the light that binds you." With each candle lit, the whispers grew stronger, filling the air with warmth, hope, and a fierce determination that began to dispel the darkness. The villagers joined hands, forming a circle around the altar, their hearts pounding in unison, their voices rising in a chant, a prayer to the ancestors, a plea for protection, for strength against the encroaching night. But just as they felt the tide beginning to turn, the growling outside intensified, a terrible sound that resonated with primal fury. The doors shuddered violently, and Mary could feel the heat radiating from the shadows, a palpable rage that threatened to break through their defenses. Suddenly, the doors burst open with a deafening crash, sending splintered wood flying into the sanctuary. The room erupted in chaos, villagers screaming, stumbling back as the darkness poured into the church, a mass of shadows and malevolence that coiled like smoke around them. Mary's heart raced as she tried to gather her thoughts, her mind racing for a way to fight back. She remembered the stories, the ancient rites that had once bound the darkness to the earth, the rituals that had protected their ancestors. They had to call upon those protections, invoke the very power that had once sealed the shadows away. "Father, we need the ancient words," she shouted over the chaos, desperation fueling her voice. He nodded, understanding dawning in his eyes. The blessings of our ancestors. We must summon their strength. They focused on the altar, raising their hands, channeling their fear into a single powerful plea. Spirits of the light, protect us. We call upon you to banish the darkness that threatens to consume us. The shadows writhed, coiling tighter around them, the air filled with a cold, choking presence. Yet, as their voices rose, the candles flickered, their flames growing brighter, illuminating the darkness that sought to overwhelm them. Spirits of the past, hear our plea, Father Donovan shouted, his voice filled with conviction. We seek your protection, your guidance. Let your light shine upon us and drive back the shadows. With every word, the shadows faltered, a momentary hesitation as if they were being pushed back by an unseen force. But the darkness retaliated, twisting and writhing, a creature of chaos that fought against the light, desperate to reclaim its hold. Mary closed her eyes, channeling every ounce of strength she had into their plea. She felt the warmth of the candles, the light surrounding her, pushing back against the cold. We will not be consumed. We will not allow fear to rule us. We stand united in the light. As her words rang out, the shadows began to retreat, their forms twisting and distorting, shrieking in a chorus of fury and despair. The darkness pulsed as if wounded, but even as it receded, a deeper shadow emerged, larger, more imposing, its presence overwhelming, a manifestation of every fear and hatred that had ever existed within Ettrick. Mary's heart sank as she recognized the figure that formed in the darkness, a twisted amalgamation of every betrayal, every moment of doubt and suspicion that had plagued the town. It loomed before them, its eyes burning with a malevolent hunger, a reflection of the darkness that had taken root in their hearts. You think you can banish me? It hissed, its voice like gravel scraping against stone. I am fear incarnate. I am the shadows that linger in your hearts, the whispers that echo in your mind. You cannot defeat me. The villagers staggered back, terror gripping their hearts as the darkness surged toward them, a tidal wave of despair that threatened to swallow them whole. But Mary stood her ground, her heart pounding fiercely against her ribs. No, you will not take us, she shouted, her voice rising above the chaos. We are not defined by fear. We are defined by our choices. The darkness hesitated, a flicker of confusion crossing its twisted features. It was a momentary crack in its facade, and Mary seized it. We are stronger than you. Together, we can push you back. With renewed determination, the villagers joined their voices in unison, their chant rising in power, calling upon the light within them, a light that had remained despite the shadows. They envisioned a world free from the chains of fear, a place of hope and unity. Together we stand. Together we fight. Shadows, begone. We choose the light. The force of their combined voices surged through the church, a shockwave of energy that pushed against the darkness, sending ripples through the shadows. The figure screamed, its form twisting and writhing as it fought against their collective strength. But slowly, inevitably, it began to retreat. The candles blazed brighter, illuminating every corner of the sanctuary, the light growing until it filled the space completely, banishing the shadows to the edges, pushing them back until they were nothing more than a memory. But as the darkness receded, a final desperate wail filled the air, echoing through the church and into the hearts of the villagers. You cannot escape me. I am bound to you, woven into your very essence. I will return. And just like that, the darkness shattered, dissipating into nothingness, leaving behind an empty silence. The villagers stood in shock, their breaths coming in ragged gasps as they tried to comprehend what had just happened. Father Donovan looked around, his face pale but filled with a fierce determination. It's gone, for now, but we must remain vigilant. The darkness will always seek to return, and we must be ready to confront it again. Mary nodded, her heart heavy but resolute. They had faced the darkness together and emerged victorious. But she understood now that the battle would not end here. The shadows would always be waiting, lurking just beyond the edges of their lives, and it would take constant vigilance and unity to keep them at bay. As the villagers gathered together, their expressions a mix of relief and determination, Mary felt a renewed sense of hope. They had faced their fears, fought against the darkness, and in doing so, had forged a bond stronger than the shadows that threatened to divide them. United, they would protect their town, their hearts filled with light against the encroaching dark. Together, they would keep the shadows at bay, ensuring that the legacy of fear that had haunted Ettrick for so long would not be allowed to return. But as they stepped out of the church into the cool night air, Mary couldn't shake the feeling that the darkness was not gone for good. It was still there, a whisper in the wind, a flicker in the shadows, waiting, watching, biding its time for the next opportunity to return. And in the quiet corners of the forest, where the trees loomed tall and silent, something ancient stirred, ready to reclaim its hold over Ettrick.